Sunny afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the January 2025 episode of the Northwest Authors Series at Cannon Beach Library. Erica Berry is our featured author today, and she will discuss her debut book, for which she received the 2024 Oregon Book Award for Creative Nonfiction. Its title is, as you can see, Wolfish, Wolf, Self, and the Stories We Tell About Fear. The book, as suggested by the title and at its most basic, has to do with wolves, humans, and human fear. Going far beyond the basic, however, Eric has intriguingly woven together the strands of research and reportage, her personal narrative, and human cultural history to explore human fear, its various underpinnings, and its intersections with race, sex, and the environment.
Am I in the way here? Yeah, it's fine.
Eric is a writer and teacher currently based in Asia, often about the intersections of feelings and the natural world, have appeared in such publications as the New York Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, Wired, Orion, and the Yale Review. She has a Bachelor of Arts from Bowdoin College in Maine, 2014, and a Master's in Fine Arts from the University of Minnesota, 2018, where she was a College of Liberal Arts Fellow. She has received several grants, fellowships, and funding, including from the UCross Foundation, an artist residency program in Wyoming, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference at Middlebury College in Vermont, Tin House in Portland, and the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources based in Wisconsin. She is also a former writer in residence at the National Writers Series in Traverse City, Michigan, and that is a year-long, they bill it as a year-long book festival, so she was there for that. As a teacher, Erica is a writer in the schools in Portland and an associate fellow at the Attic Institute of Arts and Letters, also in Portland. And I see from the website for Attic Institute that you're going to be teaching a weekend seminar there called Memoir Bootcamp in March. During the summer, Erica has taught at the Orion Environmental Writers Workshop in New York, the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology in Alaska, and the New York Times Student Journeys. Erica, we're honored to have you with us today. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you to the Sea Spray Hotel for hosting you. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Erica Berry to the Northwest Authors Speaker Series.
That's a lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming inside on one of the most beautiful days I remember having on the Oregon coast ever in a January. Thank you, Wanda, for that introduction, and thank you for this tech support and everything. I have a real fondness for libraries in little towns like this. When I lived in Michigan, there was one, and I spent many winter afternoons in the library with the sun streaming in, working on this book, which was the culmination of 10 years of work. I started it for my undergraduate thesis in environmental studies, and I was living out in Maine, and my mom got really sick. And she had a really high fever, and I was leading a canoe trip that was going to go out into the backwoods. We weren't going to have service. And I was talking to my dad on the phone. We're like, what's going on with mom? I don't know. They've been out by the Metolius River. Some of you might know that, part of Central Oregon. And he was like, she's in the ER now. Her fever is getting really high, and it's going down again. It's really high, really low. We don't know what's going on. And wolves are not really on my radar at this point, for any reason. But at some point, an epidemiologist comes into her hospital room and decides that they should test for a tick-related illness. And they found out that a rodent in the cabin had probably, brought in a tick. And he just sort of said offhandedly, if we had wolves in the ecosystem, I'd see less illnesses like this in my house. Just a side comment, but it was a moment for me where I was so worried about my mom. Suddenly she's been like in this situation that was pretty dire, and I had never thought that the wolf had anything to do with it. And it made me, so my dad's family, we can switch that. And actually, right here. My dad grew up on a sheep farm. Oh, really quickly, this is the book. This is the book in England. I just like they did a beautiful woodblock print to the cover. And they kind of talk to each other, these two howling wolves. This one, there's a couple of hands. I'll show, there'll be another slide later, but I thought they did a beautiful job with the art. You're rarely in control of things like this, but I was pleased. Okay, go one more. So this is my grandfather, late grandfather. He died actually a year after the book came out, but he had a sheep farm outside Corvallis. And my dad grew up there, and I grew up helping with the sheep. We would have to go shovel out this place, which was no fun at all on a Saturday when you're a teenager. But we would like name the little sheep, and I would get very attached to the sheep, and then they would be killed off by predators, coyotes, raccoons, not wolves, but cougars. And so I had a real awareness that at the same time that wolves belonged in this ecosystem, and they're tied to, from an environmental standpoint, the kinds of things that were making my mom sick. They're also tied to the kinds of things that I love these sheep, and I was having a hard time imagining. I was trying to think about what it meant to coexist altogether. So I'll read a little excerpt, just from this, with this image in your heads. There's a story my Gramps likes to tell about one of my early visits to his sheep farm. I must have been 2 or 3, toddling. We're walking toward the barn, and I'm running ahead in grass already mowed to fuzz by the herd, probably chasing butterflies, those ones that appeared each spring to surf the breeze like shreds of lavender tissue paper. I turn a corner, round a hill, and stop. I've seen something, made eye contact with it. Gramps, I say, breathless, running back to his ambling frame, his boots nearly my height. There's a wolf. There's an animal ahead, eyes glassy but alert, neck hooked in a metal snare trap. As an environmentalist, my Gramps believed in the conservation of wild spaces. But here on the farm, he was a tender, and he reckoned those two aims with seeming little angst. All I thought was wolf, and I did not realize that we had won. Maybe I thought the animal was still a threat, so I ran to grab my grandfather's hand. Maybe I saw panic in the animal's eyes and mistook it for my own. Gramps does not have answers to tell me about what happened after I got to him that day, and when I asked recently, he waved it off, eyes floating elsewhere. He began to tell another story. So many of my Gramps' stories are tall, stretched, sculpted. Does it go without saying, I have no memory of the encounter with the trap? No memory of the creature I thought was wolf? No memory of what twitched inside me when, if I rounded the corner alone and looked her in the eye? In French, the word loup means wolf, but in other contexts, it can also mean other things. An error in calculation, for example. Pluralized, loup is the black velvet mask worn at a costume ball. Both definitions suggest one first impression of a wolf is wrong, is not always what it seems. So I started thinking about, when I think about wolves, what do I think of? I think of a creature that would come, take the lambs. And I became really interested in that. And on the other side of my family, they're in Montana, my mom's family. And her brother-in-law is a taxidermist who does big game hunting with my cousins. And one Christmas, I'm thinking about wolves in this environmental studies context, and I see a bumper sticker on his truck. And I think it said, wolves are government-sponsored terrorists. And I thought, like, why does my sweet uncle have that bumper sticker? Why are wolves terrorists? I don't understand. But I'm a very non-confrontational person. So rather than ask him at the dinner table, I decided to start researching what wolves meant to people and why they were making people so angry. I sort of thought I'll go in, with a kind of science journalism standpoint and just figure out what wolves mean to us. So I would start by just saying to you all, when you hear the word wolf, what's the image or story or idea that comes to mind? Yeah, howling. Have you heard it before?
No, but I would like to.
Yes. Yeah. One howling or a pack howling? Do you have an image that is?
Um, what I would like is the wolf to howl, and then he, or it, or she likes the howling and starts doing that echoing, when it finishes, starts to actually do a symphony of howls.
Okay, I love that. Yeah. Other associations, the howling wolf, very evocative.
Little Red Riding Hood.
Yep, Little Red Riding Hood. Did you grow up with that narrative?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I thought of too, for sure. That's it.
How protective they are of their family.
Yeah, I became really interested in this idea that I was often visualizing. I had a wolf that I got at a tourist shop out in Montana by my family, like I don't know, one of those kind of tacky souvenirs. And it was a glow in the dark wolf howling at the top of a mountain all alone. And I would wear it when I was mountain climbing and feel really cool. And then I thought, like, what is this fascination with the lone wolf? The wolf is always alone. The wolf as this solo adventurer. And I started, and this is where I became fascinated by one wolf that was a solo adventurer. And Wolf OR7, that some of you may know, that left his pack in northeastern Oregon. So if we click, okay. So I decided to go out to Wallowa County. This is while I was a college student. And I wanted to talk to a lot of livestock producers, environmentalists. My family is sort of on both sides of that urban rural thing, and you hear a lot about it just being either pro-wolf or anti-wolf, and I saw that it's way more complex than that in my own family. So I was interested. But then I get out there and there's all these signs, learn the truth, therealwolf.com. There were feuding billboards about, learn the truth about them here. And then the next billboard would say, like, that billboard's lying. And I just became fascinated, not just by the wolf, but how we were talking about it. And it seemed to me that looking at how people argued about the wolf was actually how we were arguing about a lot of other things. And I'm interested in wolves, but I'm really, my motivation is to help understand people. And I became interested in how wolves were really just a vessel for our emotions. And it seemed like we were not going to be able to live more peacefully beside this animal without sort of figuring out how we were getting along. Okay. But I remember what's next. This is the first picture of the wolf from the Oregon Historical Society.
Mhm.
And I've spent so long looking at this wolf during the pandemic when I couldn't go out and do other reporting. And I was trying to figure out, is this wolf trapped? Is it dead? Is it alive? I couldn't really tell. But I think it became a part for me. I did not understand. My family's from Oregon. I have these farming roots here. Didn't know that the first law in Oregon was a bounty about killing wolves that settlers came together for. And that actually helped. You had Methodists and Protestants that weren't always getting along, but they could get along about the idea that we should kill the wolf. And so that actually was sort of central to the formation of this state. And I just thought, man, the first laws here are about, the wolf is over there, the wolf is dangerous, we're going to be sort of a community here. And I started thinking, like, so common to have the wolf as like the other that is this scary force. And I became really interested in that. So I went out to northeastern Oregon. This is the route that OR7 took. So OR7, as a young pup, was collared by biologists and started wandering. It's very common for wolves it's called dispersal when they're young, and they are leaving because they want more land, they want a new mate, they want food. They kind of leave for any of the reasons that we leave our family, right? You want to go fall in love, have an adventure. Wolves do this too. But the thing is that when OR7 left, there were no other wolves over here. So he started walking westward, and suddenly biologists are like, okay, this wolf is on the move, but what is it going to find? Because how is he going to find another wolf? He's out there looking for another wolf. There was none. Sorry, I have a little section about OR7. So basically, I start hearing about this wolf that's on this big journey, and I became somewhat fascinated in following the path of OR7 and thinking, what is the journey of this one wolf? Did any of you follow the OR7 path? Did you remember it? Yeah. Was it you remember headlines about it, or?
Yeah, it was covered by the Oregonian for the longest time and other media.
This section that okay, if I can't find this, sorry, I thought I had it bookmarked. It was covered everywhere.
Yeah.
There was bumper stickers that said OR7 for president. The National Enquirer, the tabloid, wrote about OR7. The New York Times said people are calling. They reported on it. They called it a cult-like following, and said people are calling wolf organizations saying all of California should be turned into a wolf state. Like, people were just obsessed. And so when OR7 crosses it across the Cascades, he becomes the first wolf in Western Oregon since wolves were killed in the 1940s. And then OR7 crosses into California, and he's the first wolf in California. And the headlines you see, it's about this time of year when wolves are mating, and they were like, Valentine's Day is in 2 weeks. Is OR7 going to find a partner? And it was totally like, this is more than a wolf here. And so I am, at that time, I'm at college. My mom's gotten sick. I'm thinking about my family with wolves. I'm like thinking about, what are wolves to us? And at the same time, I become obsessed with these OR7 follower groups. I'm in the Facebook groups, and people say, his caller chimed in. He's by a ranch, people are wanting OR7 to fall in love. Eventually, OR7 does meet a human. And I talked to a biologist who said that he got calls saying, you guys have set it up. You carried in a female wolf to fall in love. And he said, I wish we were that smart. Like, we absolutely should not do that. But it was this kind of rom-com like story of, wolf sets out alone and falls in love, and then has a pack. But then, like the rom-com, the story doesn't end there. The wolves have to, their life becomes complicated, and they began to depredate on ranchers' lots and kill livestock. And this is where I actually think it gets really interesting. Like, how do we live with wolves? Not just the sort of symbolic wolf that captures our hearts and minds traveling, but the wolf that is, interspersed with our farmland. Okay, switch. So this, to me, became the image that was sort of driving this book, which is there's the wolf out there, but then there's also the wolf that's in our minds. I started thinking about this as the shadow wolf. And that story of Little Red Riding Hood really came back to me. I didn't like that story. I felt it was a very adventurous woman, girl, I guess, who wanted to go travel alone and hike alone. Um, but I started having a couple experiences around the time I was writing this that were really scary and that made me think about Little Red Riding Hood. And one of them was I was uh, I was walking home one night and was grabbed by a stranger on a dark street, and I felt like all of my experiences thought, well, in this situation, you would fight back. You would hold your own. And my body was totally frozen. I didn't do any of the things I thought I would. And I thought, Little Red Riding Hood is a story about you're told when you encounter danger, this is the way you're going to act. And I was kind of surprised to realize I didn't feel like I could protect myself really in that situation. And I became obsessed with that story. And I felt this is really unfair to the wolf, but it's also really unfair to the girl who kind of is cast as a certain kind of victim in it. I mean, you can think about the shark. Why do we think the things we do about sharks or about, I don't know, what's another animal that kind of looms large in the imagination, the human imagination? Snakes, which I'm actually afraid of snakes. I will stand by that. But it is irrational. And so I started looking through the New York Times archives. They have an amazing way to search their online archive, and I would look for every time the word wolf pops up. Very often, it's not about the animal. But there's all of these. Well, if it's possible to go back.
Oh,
one.
good.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's all of these headlines. Not all these are the New York Times, but lone wolf held over an attack. Wolf packs prey. This was about the Central Park 5 case. All of these other ideas about crying wolf, who were wolves, and began to feel like these narratives are so unfair to wolves because if you see a wolf, they're not actually going to attack you. Odds are they're going to run off and do their thing. But also, very often, the lone wolf is somebody who we've decided is at the fringes or margins of society, and it's also there's a social justice implication to who we call wolves. And so, in this book, I was really trying to dig into that. Switch it. Okay. So This book is a real Trojan horse book in that on one level, it's about OR7 leaving home. It's about me leaving home and thinking about fear and wolves. But it's also along the way about all of these other narratives that come into play. Narratives about colonialism in Oregon, about gender dynamics in Little Red Riding Hood, and they're sort of all bundled inside. And so I'm just going to read to you. I was talking to Wanda about this earlier from a scene that for me, some people say, when did you seem like you're having a pretty good time. And I am most of the time. But they said, how did you write a whole book about fear? Did something really scary happen? And there was one thing that I think changed my relationship with fear. And I'm just going to read you. It's not too scary, but I'll read you a bit from this. And this is when I had done my own sort of wolf dispersal move. I had moved to Sicily, right off the coast of Italy. And I had taken a job working at a cooking school that I was helping with a documentary. So I finished college. I'd already been studying wolves. I didn't know at that time that there were these werewolf legends in Sicily. That were really fascinating. But I thought, okay, I'm just here. I'm doing a year working on a documentary at a cooking school. What a dream, right? Nothing bad is going to happen to me here. Towards the end of college, my roommate Eliza and I developed a bit where we asked the people we sat with at lunch what they were most afraid of. Usually there would be a pause. Are you serious? Eventually the cork would pop. One friend spoke at length about imagining his mother dying, another about being buried alive, answering so swiftly it was as if the fear sat always like a pill beneath his tongue. Always we nodded, supportive and curious, treating the question like something between conversation prompt and anthropological study. Would invite you to think about that question if I were to say, what are you most afraid of? This was our casual lunch conversation when we were 21. My interest in how others lived with their fears was selfish. I wanted advice on how to live with my own. All the same, I felt that our question was impossible to answer truthfully, not just to rank one's fears on a hierarchy, those internal acrobatics of would you rather, but to offer them to an audience. My own fears were selfish and small. Abstractly, I feared earthquakes and nuclear bombs and fascism, but at the end of this day, this meant I feared pain, a lack of hope or will to live, my own death. Mostly, I feared the space before death, the seconds or hours where I would know everything I would never do. I didn't play the fear game while I was living in Sicily because I didn't think much about dying. My brain was too full of everything else. But that night we cooked the greens that Kylie and I had foraged. I felt particularly buoyant, giddy with the gift of far-flung independence. Kylie was a chef intern from Canada who was at the cooking school. We were playing some sort of would you rather as we cooked. Marvin Gaye on the laptop speaker behind us. Kylie and I flushed and goofy with wine, while Paul, he was the gardening intern, who had never had a sip of wine because he was an athlete, he would always tell us, shook his head with a smile. By the time we were at the table, passing around artichokes stewed in wine, oily discs of grilled eggplant, a bowl of leftover lamb stew, and that sauteed pile of our foraged greens, everything seemed so perfect, so how I had imagined this year going, that I couldn't help swinging the conversation to mortality. Okay, a question. Would you rather know in advance the exact day you were going to die, or would you rather just, drop? What a question, Barry, said Paul. Some nerve. He's British, but I won't do the accent. But he was grinning now, pouring the lamb broth over the greens and forking a wad of it onto a tear of bread, his eyes narrowing with thought. Are we talking like knowing years in advance, or weeks, or days? Kylie took a swig of wine, folding her arms over her plate in that let's get down to business gesture. Either way, I said, for the sake of argument, say you have at least a year's warning. We circled the hypothetical question, and we heaped our plates, the sky blackening as a breeze rolled in, bringing the eucalyptus trees and the orange grove right to our noses, the candle in the center of the table spasming with light. We talked, we ate, and somewhere inside our bellies, still unknown for another hour or so, the toxins from the first bites of the greens were working their way to our bloodstreams, knowing our minds, our eyes, our walk. But that comes later. The poison at first was merely pleasant, like wine on an empty stomach. The room turned silky around the edges. I'll say it. I'd rather just drop dead, said Kylie eventually, and we all laughed because by that point it seemed so obvious. Torture was knowing an unwanted change was coming over one's body and being unable to stop it. Slovakians will call a drunkard a vladklok because this word for werewolf also implies he who makes a beast of himself. Becoming a beast, then, is not always a passive act. You can do it to yourself. In the Serer religion of Senegal, wolves are known as seers, transcendent, intelligent creatures capable of knowing in advance who will die. Canines have been known to howl and bark before earthquakes. They can smell the COVID-19 virus on a body before a person knows they've been infected. When I think back to that evening in our little apartment, I think of all the moments an intervention might now have occurred. When that little terrier Aurora, who lived across the villa courtyard, ran up to us, tongue out, eyes wide, barking as always, but barking maybe differently. When Kylie and I had waved off the Sicilians who stopped to offer us a ride as we picked on the hillside that afternoon. When Paul, that trained horticulturalist, walked in from the garden and we showed him what we had harvested, and he ran a hand through the leaves, smiling absent-mindedly, tired at the end of a long day. Nice, 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 ladies. When Kylie mentioned that the greens tasted bitter, maybe too metallic bitter, and poisonous plants often had this taste. When Paul then got up to examine the uncooked leaves, telling us they weren't all charred, but maybe they were docked, maybe borage, we're probably fine. That's when I brought up a conversation I'd recently had with our boss about the Italian word amaro, bitter, which was a cherished flavor there, like umami, one that us fluorescent supermarket eaters rarely appreciated and had to get used to. We're honing our palates, I said, tipsily, brattily. Plus, we've never even heard of poisonous plants around here. The flavor is too much for me, said Kylie. One of you can have my serving. Paul raised his eyebrows at me, winking. Your call, Barry. I didn't love the taste, but I thought that's probably why the wild greens were a power food, all those antioxidants. Ever the Libra, I considered. I thought of how often I wanted to eat the last bite, the one marooned on the plate by unspoken etiquette whenever I ate out with friends. And then I thought of Paul. Of all the men we could be stuck with in the countryside, he was so kind. Yes, he sometimes talked too much, taking far too long to answer easy questions, but he had been a selfless spirit. I owed him more. I passed the plate. You're a doll, he said. It wasn't until after we had peeled one orange after another, each one tasting rotten, and then tried to drink water and found that tasting rotten too, our mouths dry as moldy stinking cotton, as Paul said, that the panic really seeded. I don't feel right, he said. I feel woozy. I did too, but I was trying to convince myself this was the wine. Paul, it occurred to me now, had never been high. He'd never had a drink. At this point, under the table, I Googled poisonous plants in Sicily, trying to counter Kylie's mask of terror with a wooden, this happens every day smile on my face. There was a photo of a plant with purple flowers on my screen, a sight I recognized from the hillsides in December. There's no way we ate that, I thought. But what I said was, maybe we should all just try to vomit for good measure, just in case. I had never tried to make myself vomit before. Now I tried, but I couldn't do it. Walking back to the kitchen, I felt sheepish, but also like I was hovering about 6 inches above the linoleum. Paul and Kylie were waiting when I got back, similarly unsuccessful. I feel so tired, said Kylie, leaning into a chair. I think we did something really, really bad. I too felt tired, slow motion, stuck in something I couldn't see. Paul was silent, starstruck, moving with a robotic stagger now in his polyester track pants. We asked how he felt, and he just looked at us, blinking. At some point, we walked to the apartment of the Sicilian cook and groundskeeper. TV flickered through the curtains, and for a minute we hesitated. It was their night off. Was it really worth bothering them? My boss was out of town, so we were just there in this kind of villa, and nobody else spoke English. When the door finally opened, we held out the basket of greens. Mi dispiace, we knew enough words to say. Sorry, we ate, we bad. Poison? They looked at the leaves, smelled them, and shook their heads. Non mortale, they said, gesturing to the dark hills. Nothing deadly out there. I'm really freaked out, said Kylie as we trudged back. Paul now was silent. His eyes were popped and unblinking, like he had been possessed. Glancing between them, I boiled some water for tea. Let's all take a deep breath, I said. I think we're getting each other a little wound up. I'll pause there. So we all survived that night, but Paul ended up in a coma. And we were all in the hospital. And I was it was a very hallucinogenic night. And I think it did change my experience of being a person who eats and lives off the land and thinks about it. And I became very afraid of foraging, of harvesting things, of eating things from people's gardens. And I think one of the things that was hard was I didn't trust myself anymore. There was a newspaper article that was written about us. Then the comments were horrible. They were like, these people deserve to die. This is the Darwin Awards. As you can imagine. But what was interesting to me was while I was in Sicily, we just were not told there was anything bad. I was not absorbing narratives about fear. I wasn't reading the papers. Whereas in my adult life here, I was reading the news. You hear about the kidnapper on the street. You hear about this. And I became afraid. But there, I couldn't understand anything. I just was like living without narratives of fear around me. And I'd never felt safer. And I'd never had something so bad happen. I became really interested in what are the stories we tell about what can harm us and how to keep ourselves safe. And should you fear plants? No. Should you be very careful? Yes. Should we be careful around wolves? Yes. When I was at this wolf sanctuary, a lot of people said, I really think I could have one as a pet. I would love to take one home. I thought that's not the answer either, right? A certain amount of fear is very useful. And this is true in all of these categories. So this is just that story I share because this book is very much me personally grappling with how fear appears in my life and what are the stories that I absorbed about it and trying to kind of inventory which of those stories are good and which ones are not serving me. And in the process, thinking about wolves, which are just this broad symbol of our fear. So I can take questions or I can do a little more reading, but I would love to hear from you all. There's a couple hands.
So because this book and the whole sort of wolf cultural legacy intersects with your personal life and your personal fears as a woman. I found myself wondering, well, how would this be told if it were a man?
Great point.
Because you have a meeting of those young men who were at college, who were dressed up and who were starting to harass you, and various things like that. And the whole story of Little Red Riding Hood is all about a girl. And many of the examples you have of why tales are told, it protecting or scaring a girl so
Yeah.
she doesn't go out and get hurt. But as a man, if you're, maybe there's a little bit of glory in being a wolf. Um,
Yeah.
and maybe not so much a lone wolf, but a wolf,
Uh-huh.
and a predator and so forth. So I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
No, thank you for that question. And I think, my original plan was to write this the way that it's as if a man could have written this book. And I thought I'm just going to go out and do this adventurous reporting. And recently I did an event with a man who wrote a book about wolves. And his story of how he got into it was that he was trying to track down a rancher to talk to, or a tracker. And the guy nobody wants to talk about wolves because they're controversial. They don't want to talk on the record. And the media, we don't have a great rap. We journalists, we storytellers, it can be hard to build trust, which I totally understand. But this guy said to this male author, come back with a bottle of bourbon at 11 p.m. and we'll talk it out. And they went out and they hiked out into the woods and, got drunk by a fire. And this became his source. And he was just telling the story, and I was felt like I was shaking with jealousy. That was exactly what I wanted to do when I was 22. But would I have gone out alone with some bottle of bourbon too? I wouldn't have. And I was thinking about how so many of the stories, there's you can report, there's a thing that you're looking at, but then there's also the lens through which you're looking at it. And at one point I was on a train going off to report on wolves. I decided to take the train, being very adventurous, from Minneapolis to Portland alone. And I had a situation with a man on the train who started writing these threatening letters, and he had to be dealt with by train officials. And that was an example where I just thought, I'm not even trying to think about the situation of being a woman. I would really love to ignore it. I really hate the fact that this is at all relevant. I just want to think about wolves. But it was relevant because all of us are telling a story based on, who we are in that room. And that's true, based on our race, our gender, our age, my identity, having family that were farmers, rich, that opened certain doors of trust. So I just began to realize each of you could write a different wolf book. You each would. You each have different experiences with what the wolf means. And there's a rancher who I became good friends with through the course of this, and he had more livestock and dogs killed by wolves than anyone in the state of Oregon for a while. But he loved wolves. He thought they were fascinating. He didn't think they should be killed. He just didn't want them near him. And he called me. I sent him a copy of the book, and he called me 2 days later. And he was like, we have to talk about the sociological stuff in your book. And I got so stressed. I thought, oh my gosh, he's going to be mad at something or this or that. But actually, he said, I realized I was a wolf in my younger days. And he wanted to talk about ways that the wolf is a gendered dynamic of sort of, there's the threat, and then there's the victim. There's the predator, then there's the prey. That's often how we see. There's this very simple binary, both with wildlife and with humans. And he was reflecting on his own participation in that. And that's what he wanted to talk about, not about ranching. And I was fascinated. So I think my hope with telling these, being intimate and vulnerable about things that I've experienced, is because I really want readers to say, what would I do? What did I do that time on the public bus where somebody, or somebody followed me home? Or also, my editors from Queens, New York, and she said, I got so mad at you. Why were you so nice to these guys? And I'm like, I don't know. Good question. Why do we act the ways that we act when we're scared, or when we're, we all have learned responses. The last thing I'll say about this is that the earliest Little Red Riding Hood story was not the version I grew up with, where the woodcutter comes in and, saves the day. Out she comes. In the earliest story, Little Red Riding Hood is in bed with the wolf, and this is a version that was orally told as an oral storytelling between women, and it was really meant to be here's how to be strong. This was back in the werewolf trial days between peasants in 1700s France. And the Little Red Riding Hood says, can I take a minute? I'm going to go to the bathroom. And the wolf is like very surprised. And he's like, you can't do that. Just a minute. And he puts a thread around her foot so that she won't go too far. And she goes outside and then she ties the thread around a tree. So he pulls the thread and eventually he realizes she's not coming back. And he goes out and he realizes she's tricked him. He follows her home, but she's already home safe. And that's the end. It's a story of Little Red Riding Hood outwitting the wolf. And I just thought, what if that was the story I'd grown up with instead of, she's punished for going out and exploring. So I think parts of me were so frustrated that I had to think about Little Red Riding Hood, that I had to think about my own safety. But I began to realize, well, there's a lot of really wonderful wolf books that are written by men, and but there wasn't one that was sort of thinking about the ways that I'm a predator and prey. I was really uncomfortable with being both of those things, thinking about all the ways that we all occupy sort of both roles, because wolves at the same time, they are a predator, but they also are hunted. And there's something, I'm afraid for wolves at the same time. I have some fear. And I think that's one thing we have in common with them, is we both have like tremendous power and tremendous vulnerability. And I think leaning into thinking about that in my experiences as a young woman was one way to think differently actually about the wolves. You had a question.
Now, in your research, did you come across I think it's a mythic thing called the Hour of the Wolf?
Sounds vaguely familiar, but I can't say. Is it local to this area or?
No, I think it's a pretty universal thing about, I don't know, it's this period of time between, I don't know, I've heard like anywhere between like 3 in the morning and dawn.
Okay. Yes, actually.
And yeah.
Two things come to mind that maybe this is related to.
Mhm.
This, I do very centrally talk about an idea, entre chien et loup, which is like between dog and wolf, which comes from Latin and French, and it's twilight or dawn. And it's the time when you can't quite see, if you're walking down the road, if the figure before you is a wolf or a dog. And you can't tell, is this shape familiar or strange? And in that moment, you're like a little scared, you're not sure, but you're also maybe a little excited. And that became a way that I was sort of thinking. So that idea was super central to the book, was reading about this idea of dawn or dusk as like, can't quite tell if your fear is real. That idea became really interesting. But there's also the idea of like the black dog or the wolf is sort of like depression or anxiety. That's talked about a lot. Winston Churchill talked about this sort of the dog, maybe, I think he was referring to the black dog, but this hour of night where your anxieties are more central, which maybe could also have a tie to that. So wolves have been tied to these themes of fear for so long. There are words in Prussian and Sanskrit that combine the word wolf with outlaw. So, in so many cultures and languages, there's an idea of the wolf as sort of this like ethereal, creepy thing, which at the same time, there's many indigenous stories, of course, of people living peacefully beside wolves and learning from wolves. So I was interested in that tension. I think there's a question over here. Yeah, go ahead.
This is silly.
No silly question.
When you're in Sicily, if there were eucalyptus there, are they native to Sicily?
This is a good question there were eucalyptus that were maybe not, they would lined the estate where I was.
Really?
Yeah, and they were very lovely smelling, but they could have been planted. Everything grows there, really. So I will investigate that. Yeah.
In the book Plan of the Cave Bear, our hero, some books in, eventually has a wolf. We've all read it, as a pet. But that pet is feared by everybody else she meets. And she has to adjust then to her companion as somebody not to be afraid of. there's got to be some symbolism in there somewhere of her. I don't know. It could be a long discussion, but I always was taken by how she used that wolf in her relationships as she traveled about.
That's, yeah, sort of as like a talisman or
Yeah,
protection and.
it was an extension of her.
Mhm,
It was, don't mess with me,
mhm,
but I'm tame,
mhm,
so let's be friends.
mhm. I mean, I think that makes me think about the line between the wolf and dog, or that's sort of the tame, right? You know, the famous story of Gubbio and St. Francis in Italy, where the wolf is wandering through this medieval town, scaring people, and St. Francis goes and meets the wolf outside of the town walls and says, listen, let's make an agreement. You come into the town, we'll feed you, you don't harm anyone. And the wolf is like, okay. And it's this beautiful story of sort of opening the doors. But I always thought in that story, the wolf just kind of becomes a dog. You know, suddenly the wolf is tame. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about so many of these wild wolves is they don't really care about us. They don't really want to come hang out. You know, some did traditionally. We all know the story of like the first early wolves that were probably eating scraps at the edge of the human encampments. And some of those have become the dogs that we like dress in rainbows now. You know, there's a lot of wolves that just they're kind of, and I started thinking about that phrase, you're either with us or against us, you know? Is there something, you know, people have tortured wolves in ways that we have not really tortured other predators. Those early meetings in Oregon are now called the wolf meetings, the first legislative meetings, but um, cougars and bears were also a problem. But you don't see this sort of really um, uh, sadistic tactics used against other animals in the same way. And I think I'm often asked, like, why is that? Why wolves? And I think a lot of it is that, like, we see ourselves in them, you know, like you're talking about. There's both a gentleness and a ferocity, and they're in packs where they take care of their young, and they, you know, you have stepmother ant wolves and aunt wolves, and they're all taking care together, you know, and this is one of the things that I became so interested in is especially in America, this idea of the lone wolf is really strong. I had an ex-boyfriend once who was like, I'm a lone wolf. I just have to go out alone. And I thought that was funny because wolves actually, if they're lone wolves, they're looking for connection. They don't go out to be alone. And like wolves are such pack animals. And I thought, you know, so many of the metaphors we use to talk about wolves, even the title wolfish, you know, if you say somebody's wolfish, or they have a wolfish smile, it's usually sort of like male predatory fierce something. But actually that's just about our what's it called? Projection of what that wolf is. So a long way of thinking into your question, but yeah, that I think there is such a slipperiness between us and wolves that really, you know, you can see why that would be an extension of herself.
I was just gonna ask, if you would, tell us what the plant was that was poisonous. And what happened to your friend in the coma?
Yes.
And then I had another question that was just, you were talking about a lot of references that are other books and writings, and were there any visual artists or filmmakers that also influenced you?
That's a great question. Yeah. It was mandrake, which I knew from Harry Potter. It's the screaming plant that is like the baby with the roots. And it's, you know, later I thought as a writer, this was the best possible plant to eat because it's in Shakespeare. Romeo and Juliet were said to have taken mandrake to go into a small coma and you think they're dead, which is what I thought when this happened to Paul. And so it has this whole mythological thing. The roots were kind of used as a hallucinogen, which this again ties to actually early witchcraft and werewolf narratives where people sort of burn into kind of a beast and begin hallucinating. I, in the hospital, thought that I was I tried to escape. I yanked out the IV cords and tried to run out, and they had to capture me. I was like turned into like a wild person, you know. And at that point, I thought Paul was dead. I couldn't understand the language, and he had been tied to the bed and then had stopped shaking, and he was kind of having a seizure. And so I spent this night thinking I had helped kill him, and I was also hallucinating. And it was one of by far the most terrifying night of my life. And I think thinking I'm about to die, but also I have to sit with the fact that I have ended someone else's life. And I think this goes back to some of these narratives that I was interested in were moments where I felt like a victim, and I hated that. I did not want to feel like a victim. But this was an example where I felt like I was the predator, and that felt horrible too. They both felt horrible. And so mandrake grows commonly, and they sort of said, oh, well, it's only because you guys are foreigners that you ate this. No, because then we were talking to people at the hospital in Italian through translators, and they had said like a man in his 50s had come by and died that same season with it. His heart was weaker. I think Paul had a dose that should have killed him in his body. That moment where I gave him the plate of extra. He did CrossFit. He'd never drank. I do drink moderately or lightly. You know, I don't drink very much, but I drink and I don't do CrossFit. So I also weighed less than him. Would I have died? I feel like that's a real possibility. So he was fine. They flew him back, and they did tests, and kind of once it goes through your system, if you get through it, you're fine. But I had no memory for a couple of days, or it was very blotchy. I would like start talking and I would forget what I was saying. So Paul is kind of in this coma. Then he wakes up a few days later and was pretty okay. You know, he got tested, and I was having this like cognitive stuff. And Kylie, the third, who'd eaten the least amount, she maintained that it was the worst for her, because she was like, you guys were just crazy. Like, Erica, you were scared, but you were so crazy you didn't really know. And like I really saw how crazy you were, and I thought, you know, he's dead and she's crazy, and oh my God. So each of the three of us thinks that we had the worst experience. And that's fine. Yeah.
Are you still friends?
It's a good question. Kylie and I are. Paul wrote, he's under a fake name in this book. He wrote the article that I mentioned, that was published in a big newspaper. And he kind of said, like, you know, my colleagues foraged this stuff, and, you know, they were totally fine, but I had this dramatic day. And I thought, you're the Cambridge educated forager, dude. You know, I was a little bit like, I take responsibility, but this was pretty traumatic for all of us. And I think he really, you know, he was a little bit of an really felt like he was the victim and he'd had this terrible thing. And I don't know that he fully blamed us, but the article portrayed us as kind of dumb women that had done this thing. And yeah, there was some other dynamics that happened. When you put 3 20-somethings in a villa, you're the only three, you know, it's like a little drama's going to happen anyway. Throw in a little poison. It was, you know, it was like, could have been a little TV episode, but we are all, you know, friendly. If we saw each other, we'd all be friendly. We'll end on that. We should say something about wolves, not just about poisoning my colleagues. I love cooking now and can vouch, have never poisoned you. So far, so good.
As far as I know.
Yeah. Very
Start
good.
slow.
You know, they said originally in the hospital, they said, they asked if we'd done drugs because our pupils were very big. And that is, belladonna is another poison, you know, and that belladonna in Italian means beautiful woman because her pupils were big. It makes her pupils go big. And this is also tied to these witch narratives. And I was, of course, thinking of that case with Amanda Knox, where she, you know, and so I remember them saying in Italian, like, have you had cocaine? And I was hallucinating, but trying so hard to answer, absolutely not. And please do not imprison me on top of this. I was trying to make it through the night. We were clutching a Tupperware of the greens with us in the hospital, but the hospital itself had no hand sanitizer, no Wi-Fi. I couldn't talk to my parents. You know, it was a country hospital that we had to drive an hour to. And so it was really this
Wait,
strange.
how did you get there?
The groundskeeper eventually drove us, but yeah, it was just a very strange. Paul, at one point, he was really losing his, kind of pretty mad, which is what these stories of people who would take this and sort of think they're werewolves. And at one point, I remember he just opened the car door and started kind of scrambling off the hillside. And just that was when I later was reading these werewolf stories about early stories of werewolves were probably people who were ingesting kind of drugs. And I just thought, oh my gosh, we have turned ourselves into werewolves right now. We are fully crazy. But the cooking school got a good laugh out of it years later. So if that had not happened to me, I don't know if I would have become so fascinated with thinking about fear. So everything is either a good time or a good story. Thank you all for sharing this space.
Have there ever been wolves in Sicily or Italy?
There were years ago. Yeah, there's a lot in